Hello, this is Ted Morrissey. I'm making a video for my experimental writing course in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program. And I wanted to focus this video on one of the aspects that's discussed in the introduction, actually introductions, multiple introductions in the BACS 2020 anthology that we're using. That's the best American experimental writing anthology. And in particular, it talked about market pressures and trying to get into the hands of readers experimental writing. And to do that, there had to be some marketability, had to be attractive financially for a publisher to be able to bring that book out, et cetera, et cetera. And several of us kind of keyed on that. And obviously, that's one of the issues that comes up when you start talking about experimental writing, because it's not the most popular form of writing nowadays in terms of the number of readers who are interested in it, and therefore the number of publishers who are interested in publishing it. But I wanted to maybe focus on that aspect, and I'm not sure that writers today all know just how much that has changed in the last 75 years or so. What I mean by that is it's very difficult to make a living as a writer now, but that hasn't always been the case. And so I wanted to just give you some information about that. Again, maybe just for some historical perspective. It won't necessarily help you to be a better writer today, but again, it just may be useful information. And it may be good to know that it is so much more difficult today to get things published, especially to get things published to make any money off of them, compared to other time periods. If we are comparing ourselves now and our successes in terms of publication and money earned and so forth with writers of previous generations, we're definitely comparing apples to oranges, because it's a very different ballgame today. That is because of the explosion of other entertainment options, streaming services, video games, and so on. Whereas in earlier generations, reading was a major pastime for pretty much everyone. And so there was a lot more writing being published. Magazines and book publishers were much more inclined to pay writers well for their work. And it was much easier for writers to attract attention of a national audience and that kind of thing. So I want to speak to that just a little bit and put some hard numbers to it. Again, just maybe for some historical perspective. I'm actually going to be reading from the proof pages of a book that I'm working on. It's a collection of short stories and sonnets of mine. I'm bringing it out through my own press because, quite honestly, no other press would publish it. I just wanted to bring it out because a lot of the stories that I published years ago were in magazines and so forth that have ceased to exist. And so rather than have all this work just sort of disappear, I wanted to maybe try to bring it together into a book and maybe give it a little more longevity. But I've been writing an introduction to this collection for a while, and one of the things I speak to is this change in how things used to be for writers compared to how they are now. And so I'll just read 2 or 3 paragraphs here from the introduction. And again, this may be common knowledge for you, but on the other hand, if you're a little bit younger, I doubt that you know necessarily quite so much about how things used to be compared to the way they are now. All right. So again, let's read a little bit from the introduction here. There had been a standard path to book publication for writers of fiction throughout the 20th century and the 19th, perhaps even rooted in the 18th. Writers would begin by placing stories in literary magazines with small circulations. As they continued to hone their craft, they'd start placing stories in nationally distributed magazines like Atlantic Monthly, Collier's, Esquire, Redbook, Cosmopolitan, Playboy, and the list would go on and on and on. There used to be a lot of nationally circulated magazines that published short stories and excerpts from novels and poems and that kind of thing. That would then allow them to build an audience of readers and get the attention of an agent or publisher who would champion their first novel. So as writers would publish in, again, the Atlantic or Saturday Evening Post or Red Book or Cosmopolitan or wherever it might be, that would then go out to hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of subscribers. And so those people would read short stories by whoever it might be, Kurt Vonnegut or Joyce Carol Oates or what have you. And then people would begin to know them as writers. So then when a book publisher would finally start publishing their novels and collections of stories and so forth, there would already be hundreds of thousands or millions of readers who already knew who they were. So they'd go to their local bookstore, see their book that's just been released. Oh, I know that writer. I've read, two or three or four or a dozen stories by that writer already. I really like their stuff. I'm going to buy their book. Right? So that was a very common path to getting one's first novel published. And go on a bit. There had been a golden age of magazine publication for much of the 20th century when fiction writers could make a good living selling stories to magazines. In the 1920s, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda lived their legendary high life almost solely from Fitz's short stories, which could fetch as much as $4,000 per story. That's nearly $60,000 in 2023 money. Imagine that. Imagine selling a short story, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 word short story, and someone handing you a check for $60,000. That was commonplace in the 1920s. It's estimated that during the 20s and 30s, Fitzgerald made almost $250,000. That's $250,000 in 1920s and 30s money from 164 magazine stories that he wrote and sold. That's more than $3.25 million today. So in just a little over a decade, basically, writing short stories, many of which were pretty mediocre because he was cranking them out pretty quickly, and he would have been the first to admit that they weren't that great, which wasn't something he was proud of necessarily, but it was just to keep the money coming in. But he made $3.25 million in today's money just writing short stories during that time period. A generation later, in the 1950s, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. sold 4 stories to magazines in the course of 18 months, allowing him to quit his job in the marketing department at General Electric and devote himself fully to writing. At the time, Vonnegut was supporting a wife and 6 children. So, again, 1950s, Kurt Vonnegut is working for General Electric, writing ad copy and that kind of thing, and then kind of on the weekends and the evenings, writing short stories. And he ends up selling 4 of them in about a year and a half, and they made him so much money that he could quit his full-time job and just start writing full-time. Again, imagine today that you could just sell 4 stories in the course of about a year and a half to magazines, and you could quit your job even if you were supporting a spouse and 6 children. I mean, it's hard to even conceive of the difference financially between being a writer in the first half of the 20th century versus now. By the 1960s, however, television had begun turning the golden age into lead, kind of like that line. And by the time I started to write effectively enough to publish, and this is the 1990s, the golden age was rapidly receding, a rapidly receding memory. In some, television had superseded book reading as a popular pastime, and nationally distributed magazines had either severely cut back or eliminated space for short stories altogether, thus closing a crucial avenue for new writers to build an audience, let alone make a living. So, and it happened very quickly, where television replaced reading, and then with the advent of the computer and video games and so forth, that in very short order, magazines, people subscribing to magazines, really just kind of took a nosedive. And so what a lot of magazines had to do was to cut back on the space they were devoting to fiction and use that for ad copy, or maybe they decreased the size of their magazine, went from 170 pages to 120 pages or whatever it might be. And what they eliminated usually was the short stories, because people just weren't paying attention to them, quite honestly. All right. So that was one blow to writers in terms of trying to amass an audience, a national audience who would know who they were, would be interested in buying their books and so forth. And then book publishing is very different now as well. Um, this is the most recent issue of Boulevard. I subscribe to several literary journals. I like to kind of keep an eye on what's going on out there in the small press publishing world. And so this arrived recently, and it includes an interview with Joyce Carol Oates, who is a writer that I really admire. Obviously, highly prolific. In my long story and novellas course, we read her little novel or novella Black Water, which I think is just terrific. And so when this issue arrived and there was an interview with her, I was really anxious to read it. The interviewer, by the way, is Ryan Krull, Krull. And it's mainly a craft interview, talking to her about her writing process and where her ideas for her stories and novels and so forth come from. So that's all very interesting. But I was also interested in this question and then her response to it. The interviewer says to her, what do you think has been an underappreciated change in literary fiction in the past 50 years? I often hear it bemoaned that a novelist's debut needs to be a breakout these days in a way that wasn't true decades ago. There's Amazon too, and the internet more broadly robbing us of our ability to focus. The canon has evolved, but what am I missing here? You've had a front row seat in the literary scene for 50 years. What differences between now and the 1960s go unrecognized, or are things not really all that different? And this is what Joyce Carol Oates responded to that question. Primarily, the major difference is that when I began writing, when Russell Banks and others of our intrepid generation began writing, a publishing house was generally prepared to support the early work of a writer in whom they believed, acknowledging that probably, in fact very likely, this writer would not begin to sell well or to make money, incongruous in literary fiction in any case, for some time. My first publisher, Vanguard Press, had been supportive of the young Saul Bellow, James T. Farrell, and other writers of distinction associated with the left liberal socialist causes. Vanguard was really an exceptional editor named Evelyn Schrift, who'd said that she had recognized my talent immediately and published a succession of my novels and short story collections, often accompanied by full-page ads in the New York Times Book Review. That would be unheard of now. Unless a young writer had a breakout bestseller, virtually no publisher would treat them so generously. Schrift was a daughter of a highly intellectual, music-loving Jewish family, the sort of person who loved books and what might be called the literary tradition. Since TV, let alone social media, video games, and streaming did not exist in these days, of course, there wasn't much competition for serious books. So not only were new writers more likely to be able to get publishing contracts because people were recognizing their names from these nationally distributed magazines, so many of which published short fiction and novel excerpts and so forth. But once a book was published, even if it was the very first book, the publishing house would put all kinds of money behind the advertising campaign so that people would pay attention to it and read it and so forth and so on. Again, nowadays, that's just not happening. She also talks about the fact that there wasn't necessarily an expectation that your first book or your fifth book would make money, especially if it was more literary, more innovative, that kind of thing. I've also written papers about this phenomenon and talked about Cormac McCarthy. He's another writer who's very similar in that his first novels did not sell well at all. He had one devoted editor at Random House, Albert Erskine, who kept his books in print pretty much single-handedly for 20 plus years until finally the reading public kind of caught on and started to appreciate Cormac McCarthy's work. And now he's pretty much a household name. And, people who read serious fiction tend to know who Cormac McCarthy is and have read several of his books and so forth. But he kept writing and publishing, and Random House kept publishing his books, even though they didn't really make any money. again, would not happen now. If you don't, if they don't think they can make $1 million off of your first book, they're not going to publish you. And if you don't make $1 million, probably a second book contract is not coming your way either. So it's highly competitive, and the emphasis is definitely on making money and not promoting a writer of talent, as Joyce Carol Oates says, and so forth. Um, in fact, the publishing business has changed dramatically too, in the sense that we only have about 4 or 5 big commercial publishers left in the U.S. The rest have been either gone out of business or they've been purchased by these larger companies. And so it looks like there might be several publishers, but they're all actually housed under one parent company. And so again, the emphasis is on making money, not promoting a writer or promoting their art and that kind of thing. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to include another video link in this thread, a video that I made about a year ago based on the same readings. And in that video, among other things, I tell the tale of Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick. So I would encourage you to take a look at that video as well. All right. But otherwise, I'd ask you to make a comment or two about this video in our announcements thread in the course, and see what you have to say about any of that. All right. So I will see you down the digital road.